breaking barriers and bridging the gaps between patients and doctors. Welcome to Brainstorming with the Docs and your co-hosts, Dr. Glenn Harrison and Dr. Kolby Condos.
All right, everyone, welcome back to this week's episode of Brainstorming with Dr. Harrison and Dr. Kolby Condos. In this week's episode, we are going to break down for you SIBO. SIBO stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and it's a condition that affects tons and tons and tons of people each year and is actually really common and really easy to manage if you are proactive and you take the steps necessary to eliminate the lifestyle and dietary choices that you're making that is triggering this condition. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Glenn Harrison, owner of the Functional Neurology Center in Colorado. So how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Dr. Kolby. Yeah, this is a topic that a lot of people don't know about. And, it was a couple of years ago, it got a lot of wind and everybody had SIBO and everybody was diagnosed with SIBO and everybody was running around looking for SIBO. SIBO is, it's not a new thing, just like we talked about last podcast. It's not a new thing, but it's something like you hit the nail on the head. It has to be a proactive approach, because if you catch it early and you deal with it early, you can prevent all sorts of long-term degenerative conditions. I know you'll get into the neurology of it. So yeah, SIBO is it is frustrating. It can be terrible. But there are ways to deal with it. So today we're going to do that. So I'll let you jump into it, Dr. Kolby. You can maybe touch on what is SIBO. I know you gave the name, but what does it look like?
Right. So SIBO, again, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. What this is when everyone has bacteria that is normally occurring throughout their digestive tract at certain parts. And what happens when you have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is actually the bacteria in the lower part of your digestive system actually multiply, and they start making gas. And what happens is that gas eventually stretches out a valve that's normally closed, and the bacteria move, or they translocate is what it's called. They move through this valve into your small intestines. And in your small intestines, there's ample amounts of food, ample amounts of energy, and these bacteria just explode. The populations just explode, and they multiply super rapidly. So when you have like SIBO, what happens is you can get a lot of flatulence, a lot of diarrhea, depending on the type of bacteria. That's another thing. It's not like one specific strand of bacteria. It's different cultures that can cause different side effects. You can get extreme flatulence or gas. You can get extreme bouts of diarrhea. You can get extreme constipation. You get abdominal distension. All of this stuff can really indicate that you're suffering from SIBO. And the difficult part with SIBO is it's really difficult to diagnose. You can use, a variety of diagnostic, modalities, whether that's a hydrogen breath test or a methane breath test, or even like a blood test or a stool sample. But the problem is a lot of people don't investigate it that far. So a lot of people come in and they're like, oh man, my stomach's really hurting. I'm having difficulties with my digestion, and they just get diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome or something to that nature.
Yeah.
So when you look at the actual pathophysiology of it, there's a reason, right? The diet is part of the reason why you're having this translocation of the bacteria. It can be that you're feeding them certain foods that is allowing them to multiply. The multiplication produces the gas because they're fermenting those foods. And that's ultimately what can cause the translocation of the bacteria into the areas that has even more food and energy. So
yeah, you definitely summed it. What I see for symptoms, and you kind of hit on this, but what I see is people will come in and they'll say, first thing in the morning, my stomach is the best. And as it goes throughout the day, the bloating gets worse and worse and worse. I've had women show me when they're in the office, and it looks like they're 2 to 3 months pregnant. They have this massive distended abdomen. And they're frustrated, their clothes don't fit, it's insecurity and all of these different things. And it's uncomfortable to begin with. So that bloating is a classic example. Gas is as well. You went through all the physiology of how this happens. One thing that I see that kind of sets up an environment for SIBO. So never, just like adrenal fatigue, don't blame adrenal fatigue as the problem. SIBO, don't blame SIBO as the problem. It's just an environment that was allowed to happen, the perfect storm where this little bacteria translocates, as you said, Dr. Kolby, gets up to the small to the larger or small intestine, where it can grow and feed and off gas and all of those and multiply. But one of the things that I see that is foods are a big risk, but slow digestion. So when I see people can do good, they don't have SIBO, and then sleep deprivation, they maybe fall off their activity regimen or whatever it is, or emotional distress, any of these stressors, slowing down the body's gastric content. So the food moving through their digestive tract slows down. When it slows down, that's when that little bacteria has a chance to grow and multiply. So a lot of times I see low thyroid function, because thyroid slows everything down if it's running low. That can be a high risk factor. Fatigue, exhaustion, sometimes other hormonal imbalances. Those are the ones that I see. Someone, if they're fatigued, they can, and I see a lot of brain fog with SIBO. Do you ever see that, Dr. Kolby?
Oh yeah, absolutely. When you have something like SIBO too, what can happen is that your intestinal permeability, which basically means, the amount that the intestines are open, right? So your intestines naturally let things in, but it's selective. So it only lets certain things in. And what can happen when you have SIBO or other digestive issues like that is that those junctions, or those like little openings, get wider. And then all of a sudden, when those junctions open up, more things get through, and your body perceives that as being a pathogen or like an infection, right? So we've covered this in previous podcasts too. We covered one, it's called the brain-gut axis. If you guys have any more questions about kind of more the physiology of that, feel free to look back at that one. That one will cover this a little bit more thoroughly. But basically what happens is your intestinal tract becomes more permeable. It allows more big chunks of food, more pathogens, more infections, more bacteria into your body. Your immune system ramps up, and then that causes inflammation. That inflammation eventually generalizing a lot, but it ends up in your brain, and then you get brain fog. Yeah. It can also cause issues with sugar regulations and stuff like that. But going back to what you said also, where, that transit time where that food is sitting in there longer, it just makes sense. And I've used your analogy before, if something's sitting in there longer, they're going to eat it more and they produce more gas. This is just going to make the infection worse, because then that actually causes more gas, pushes on the ileocecal valve, which is that valve that's between the lower portion of the GI tract and the small intestines. And then it opens more, and then more bacteria rush in. So not only are you multiplying in the small intestines because of the bacteria already there, but then you're also letting more bacteria in.
Yeah, and it just turns into this cycle, this snowball gets worse and worse. I've seen people that I'd see with 30 years, and they didn't know what it was. They were just always bloated, always had brain fog, balance disorders, a lot of gas. It's just the way they were. And it was quite a web to untangle. So most of these people had low gastric motility, so their digestion was slowing down. So that had to be addressed, trying to change the environment so SIBO could disappear. So now we talked about the causes, we talked about some of the symptoms. What we talked even about the test. What would you say, what would your approach is, what is the medical approach to SIBO, and is it even recognized? And then go into maybe what the natural approaches would be for this.
Sure. So, when you suspect that you have SIBO, there's a couple different options like we talked about. There's the breath test, which checks for methane and hydrogen. And basically what those are gases that are given off depending on the certain strain of bacteria that you have in your digestive tract. If you have hydrogen, you're more likely to have a certain strain of bacteria. If you have methane, you're more likely to have a certain strain of bacteria. And then inversely, those two different types of gases actually provoke two different types of intestinal responses. So, if you have one type of gas, you're going to have chronic diarrhea. You have the other type of gas, you're going to have, constipation and, fecal retention, stuff like that. So that is two of the more common practices. But then you also can have a blood test, and you can also have stool sample too. As far as the treatment goes, they can use antibiotics, and those do work. However, it's kind of like if you're not removing the reason that it's happening in the first place, it's just going to come back. So they actually have a really high rate of reoccurrence through the use of antibiotics. So there are instances in my practice where I have recommended, because of the severity of the infection, that I've sent people out for antibiotics. But then we really work on those dietary and lifestyle modifications to make sure that it doesn't happen again. because the last thing you want to do is you go and spend a lot of money on antibiotics and have to do it again in 6 months. So then we really work on diet and lifestyle. We work on eating healthy. We work on eating foods that are high in certain macronutrients and micronutrients. We look at eating a balanced diet as far as like having short chain fatty acids and proteins and all those things in there too. And then also from a nervous system standpoint, because I work a lot with the central nervous system as a functional neurologist, we look a lot about like vagal toning exercises. And what your vagus nerve does is it actually is that hard wire that goes from the lower portion of your brainstem all the way to your gut that controls gastric motility. So basically how fast something moves from here out. And we work a lot with vagal toning exercises so that the rate that you are the transit time, so the time that it enters your mouth to the time it leaves, is appropriate. So you're not retaining food and it's not sitting there and fermenting. So.
Yeah, the vagal nerve exercise, we do quite a bit of that in our office, and it's extremely powerful. It's not the whole story. There's no one piece to SIBO. Some diets will run really strong FODMAPs diets. You can look up that. But I don't recommend any of these SIBO diets long term because your body becomes deficient with the nutrients, and that opens up a door for SIBO. So yeah, be careful with the diets. Be careful. It takes a big approach. Neurological exercises, speeding up your gut problems, your gut motility, overcoming leaky gut. If you have a thyroid problem. If you have a thyroid problem, SIBO is a factor. If you're fatigued and exhausted, SIBO is a consequence. So please don't see SIBO as just the thing.
If you do have thyroid too, I'll put this in there. We also did a podcast telecast on this previously. So if you do have those issues, please see back to the other ones if you need some help understanding those, because we also just broke those down a couple weeks ago.
Thanks, Dr. Kolby. Yeah, there is a massive amount of information. You'll be able to reference things that we're talking about just be going in previous podcasts, and then you'll learn the whole story. Another way test that we used to do was, instead of doing all the breath tests and the blood tests and all that, it's a crude way. It's not necessarily perfectly accurate, but it usually can cause a problem. I don't know if you've ever done this, Dr. Kolby, where you prescribe a handful of different probiotics, multiple different cultures, and you take them and you just keep consuming them. Within a day, if you become bloated, you can guarantee that's probably SIBO, because what you're doing is you're adding more bacterial strains to your small intestine where there's already a problem, and it can cause a big problem. So back to reiterate, some common symptoms of that bloating, distension, gas. It gets worse throughout the day. Tends to be best first thing in the morning. Starchy type vegetables and fruits tend to make this bloating worse. But I've seen people, severe cases, a glass of water, they become distended instantly. And then if you take probiotics and you feel like it's making it worse, there's another pretty good sign that SIBO is a candidate. And
on top of the probiotics too, I've had this happen to me. People are like, I'm taking probiotics. You look at it and you're like, oh, this is a really high quality probiotic, but it's got prebiotics in there. So then it's got sugars and stuff like that that's designed to keep that, those bacteria healthy and absorbable until they get into your GI system. And then all of a sudden the capsule breaks open and all of that sugar and everything that's, the arabinogalactin or whatever that's in there is feeding the infection too. So then they can get worse from that standpoint also.
Exactly. Yeah, it tends to be a bit of a mess. And then there's one thing, you mentioned this, Dr. Kolby, at the start, a proactive approach to SIBO, or as soon as you get it, get rid of it ASAP. Because, and I know you can elaborate on this, when you have this bloating and distension in the intestines, your intestines have this spider web of nerves wrapped around them. These nerves are very important for every aspect of digestion, but these nerves are somewhat fragile. So from what we understand as of right now, maybe you can elaborate, because this is as far as I understand of it, when the intestine stretches, of course there's this leaky gut component we talked about, but also it can injure the nerves, this network of the spider web of nerves that are around the pipe or the intestine. And if SIBO gets long enough where there's enough stretching over enough time, you can damage those nerves and you can end up with a permanent neurological condition due to SIBO.
Yeah, absolutely. So you look at nerves, and really what, mechanical deformation of nerves can really cause a problem with is when it gets so extreme and substantial, is that it actually can interrupt the localized blood supply, right? So then you look at, stretching. So if you take it's like a Chinese finger trap or whatever, even a hose, you stretch a hose out and eventually you stretch it long enough and it pinches, right? The diameter gets so thin that there's no water getting out the other end of the hose. The same thing can happen with arteries and the veins surrounding the nerves. And actually that mechanical deformation of the arterious supply or the blood supply to those nerves can actually cause, the degradation of the nerves. And then they don't fire as well. Then they go through, they can go through Wallerian degeneration, which is like where the nerves have to repair from the ends back in. Then they're, not as receptive to stretch via end organs and stuff like that on the nerves. So yeah, I mean, it's the whole thing. Repetitive injury and stuff like that can cause substantial damage to the mesenteric nervous system for sure.
Yeah. If these nerves get damaged enough, SIBO is on the table indefinitely, or at least some level of it, plus other conditions. So don't ignore that bloating. That bloating is, and all of these symptoms. You can go find a healthcare provider, or even us. I know I can work remotely. I know you can, Dr. Kolby, as well. I'm in Denver, and Dr. Kolby's in outside remote Minneapolis. We'll call it.
Yeah, almost Canada.
Yeah, but there's you can turn this around, and a lot of times if it's done right and you catch it early, now you can't make any. I have seen cases where some of the symptoms of SIBO went away as fast as just a couple of days. So if you catch it early enough in many other situations, I have seen cases where it would take weeks to go away or even months. So everybody's different, but if you catch it early, you can stomp it out and prevent these chronic degenerative issues as we talked about.
Absolutely. And don't wait. If you notice something's wrong, if you're getting the swelling, you're getting some of these signs and symptoms, don't wait and do it. Be proactive about it. And then on top of that, just maintain, once you figure out what works for you, just maintain that lifestyle, right? A lot of these conditions that we talk about and we break down can really be treated and managed and prevented through healthy diet lifestyle. So if you guys have any questions, like Dr. Glenn said, please reach out to us. You can find us on the web. Our website is www.northlakeschiropractic.com. You can get us on Facebook too, which is North Lakes Chiropractic and Functional Neurology. Dr. Harrison?
Yeah, website is probably the best to track down us and get all the information. There's lots of information. That's www.drgharrison.com, or you can just Google search the Center of Functional Medicine, Denver, and you'll find us.
Right on. Well, I don't know what we're talking about next time, but I'm sure we'll come up with some interesting little tidbit for you guys. If you guys got value from this, please go back and watch our other podcasts, telecasts, YouTube, whatever you guys are watching this on, and share it with your loved ones. Share it with some people who you feel like might get value from this stuff. Honestly, that's why we're doing it. We're doing it for you guys, trying to bring a little bit of awareness to some common healthcare conditions that can really impact people negatively. So please share it with everyone you love, and we'll see you guys next time.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kolby.
You bet, man. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.